The COVID-19 pandemic brought about many significant shifts and made supply chain resilience the key theme across boardrooms. It also accelerated the move towards digitalization across sectors. But despite lockdowns and restrictions, global trade continued and e-commerce sales surged. DHL, the global leader in logistics, is confident that trade will in fact grow faster in 2023 than it did over the previous decade, with countries like Vietnam, India and Philippines being key growth drivers. So today on the Global Dialogue, to discuss the outlook for global trade and DHL's plans for India and the world, joining me is John Pearson, the CEO of DHL Express. John, what a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us here on the Global Dialogue, and welcome to India.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in India, as always, and to be talking to you.
Well, John, let's start about getting your outlook as far as global growth is concerned, specifically on trade. DHL does a whole bunch of studies, including the DHL Trade Growth Atlas, and that throws up some very interesting insights. You're talking about global trade, in fact, being better than the previous decade in 2023, despite all of the headwinds that we've spoken of, despite the Russia-Ukraine war. What gives you this confidence, and what are you seeing on the ground at this point in time?
Yeah, sure, that's a great question. And sometimes I've been, well, not criticized, but sometimes I've been criticized for coming across as too positive when it comes to trade. And I want to make a very important distinction here. You know, right now we may be moving towards a recession, and things in the world have definitely slowed down over the last 6 months. But typically, when I talk about global connectedness or I talk about the Global Trade Atlas, I'm commenting more about the mid and the long term. And I make comments like trade is stronger at the end of the pandemic than it was before. Export growth has bounced back to higher levels than it was before. And these are all absolutely factually correct statements. They're statements about the here and now, and oftentimes they're statements about what's coming. And, you know, I'm obviously very pro-globalization. DHL Express, one of our internal taglines is that we're the experts in exports. That's what we grew up doing, importing and exporting global trade. And the prognosis from the Global Connectedness Index, which we've run for over a decade now, and the Global Trade Atlas, which we did as a one-off report, is extremely positive. In fact, India, Vietnam, Philippines and Thailand came out as sort of clear winners from the Global Trade Atlas in terms of benefiting from global trade, perhaps benefiting from somewhat of a China plus one strategy, and really driving trade in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific as a whole. And that was very clear from the study. And Vietnam and in India and the Philippines particularly. So I am positive about it, and you know, from a mid-term outlook, most of my comments come. And you know, we've had a long association with NYU and Stern in terms of putting this publication out. And interestingly, it's never been more hotly anticipated and desired than it is now, as people really try and understand what is happening with supply chain and supply chains and supply chain resilience. And perhaps we'll talk a little bit about supply chain resilience in a moment or two.
Yes, I want to talk about supply chain resilience in a minute, John, but I just want to pick up on a couple of things that you spoke of there. Let me start by talking to you about the short-term outlook. While you said that you're very positive in the medium to long term, you did bring up the fact that large parts of the world are expected to be headed into a recession in the near term. Now, are you starting to see visible signs of a slowdown, even as far as your own business is concerned at this point in time? You know, we're in the midst of the holiday season. We've just gotten done with the Black Friday sales. What was that like for you? And more importantly, when we talk about supply chain resilience and the China plus one strategy that seems to be playing out at this point in time, it seems evident that the fears of deglobalization may be overstated, but what we are seeing at this point in time is reglobalization. Would that be accurate?
Sure. So let me take those two points there. One is the peak season, which is really an exciting topic at this time of year. Then I'll come on to that topic of globalization. Look, I think the best way of saying it is that, you know, with concerns over Russia or Ukraine, some difficulties with China lockdowns, worrisome situations about recession and energy prices, I think the world is a little bit muted, I suppose, and that affects volume growth. But we're into peak season now. We're in the week after Black Friday, and the Black Friday thing is sort of the week of Black Friday and the week after, and we're seeing very strong volumes come through our network. Typically, the hockey stick, as I like to describe it, is fairly well elevated, as if someone is actually playing hockey, and the hockey stick, the elevation of the hockey stick is a little bit lower this year, but it's too early to tell what sort of peak season. I saw the volumes for last night. They were also quite strong as we go into this second week of Black Friday. I think the thing is that business heals, and trade is very self-resuscitating. You know, I have, you want, you have, I want. People buying things, selling things, repairing things, trading things. Business goes on, and I can find many industries all over our network. In fact, some here in India during my visit, where absolutely there's a very strong pulse, and business is extremely healthy at the minute. So I think we shouldn't talk ourselves into a recession. You know, we know there are some sort of dark clouds out there, and we're just watching all these lines like a hawk, because that then plays into our network setup and our aviation setup, and making sure we have the right aviation assets in the right place at the right time to make sure that supply chains remain very effective and efficient for our customers. Because the only one priority we've got right now is to deliver a great peak season for our customers. As I say, internally, we can't go away for our happy holiday Christmas lunch or end of year celebrations unless the floor is clean and all our shipments have been delivered. And maybe I can just hop on to that globalization question. I think supply chains have been based on two things: efficiency and economics. And those two things have served companies and countries extremely well over the last 2 decades. And that's why supply chains are set up as they are today. Now, people talk about nearshoring and reshoring, but let me take you back to 2014 or 12 when the Icelandic ash cloud crisis happened. Now, many people now think of that as a 2 or 3 day weather event. It wasn't. It was a 30-day global supply chain catastrophe. There wasn't one aircraft flying above the sky in Europe, other than actually 1 or 2 DHL aircraft. And everyone at the time was saying, we're going to bring our inventory back to Europe, closer to where our consumers are, and we can't go through this type of situation again. What happened? Very, very little. Because of the efficiency of those supply chains that people had been using. And what's more, changing the primary or secondary or tertiary supply chain partners is actually a very complex thing. So people think they may want to depend less on China, but changing here or there doesn't necessarily lower that level of dependency. The average kilometers flown of world trade is still about 6,500 kilometers, as it was a decade ago. And that KPI is extremely important to me because it talks about how far in kilometer distance terms trade is flowing. And if there had been a material shift in terms of nearshoring or reshoring, certainly nearshoring, you would see that distance come down. What we are seeing, though, is that, and the Global Trade Atlas very clearly said that, is that India, Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, some of these countries are strong beneficiaries of a more flexible and backup-oriented supply chain setup, as opposed to just depending on China. So that is happening, and we can see our volume growth out of those markets as extremely strong. So whilst there are things happening in the world that might put a little bit of a wet blanket on some aspects of trade growth, there are other things happening, and trade deals are one of them, that strengthen the growth from any one market. And that's how I talk about those two topics of how we look at peak season and how we talk about this topic of globalization. There is some finessing of global supply chains around the edge, and some high precision tooling, high value equipment, no doubt may be brought closer to where it's going to be consumed, and so on and so forth. But by the bulk of it, by and large, the bulk of it is absolutely quite established. I often use the denim jean industry in Bangladesh as an example. You know, some of these industries have been located in the countries they're in for a very good reason. And it's typically supply chain resilience. And that is not changing overnight. But we watch it like a hawk, as I said, and we have the most flexible and the most optionality and the most flexibility in our aviation network.
Yeah.
So if different countries start growing faster than they had anticipated doing, we can adapt to that.
You know, John, thank you very much for that perspective, as well as a little bit of a reality check on supply chain shifts that a lot of people have been commenting on. And you're right, you know, we're talking about nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, but all of this is going to take its time to play out. But I want to specifically address these growth engines that you spoke of, the trends that you are seeing in countries like Philippines, Vietnam, and India, and this hypothesis of these markets emerging as backups to China in the context of what's happening there. Are you seeing at this stage a significant slowdown out of China, not just on account of the COVID restrictions, but also on the possible fears of the Chinese economy closing in and becoming much more insular? And why is it that Philippines, Vietnam, and India are emerging as the hotspots in terms of backups?
China is, let me say very clearly, China is an extremely important market for us that is typically growing at strong double-digit CAGR. Obviously, during the pandemic, the companies and organizations have been under extreme pressure to be able to continue servicing their customers and servicing their own markets. And in fact, you know, I'd like to take this opportunity as sort of give a strong double tap for pride for our people there, because the operating conditions as a consequence of the policy and the regulation in terms of restricting the spread of COVID has made it difficult for companies to operate as seamlessly and efficiently as they might otherwise do. So I think there is, you know, the COVID situation in China that obviously plays out on a day-to-day basis. We don't see, whilst it's very clear that some companies are identifying Vietnam, India, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia as secondary or tertiary manufacturing or production sites. That's evident to me. And as I travel to Vietnam or even to India, I can see examples, so to speak, of growth trends or lanes where they've been the beneficiary of some sort of supply chain flexibility that we were talking about just a few moments ago. But yeah, let's not very clear that the situation in China prior to the pandemic and even through the pandemic has shown the way in which their export infrastructure is established and how important it is that we continue to service that market in the same way that we always have done.
We'll take a break here on the Global Dialogue and continue our conversation with the Global CEO of DHL Express, John Pearson.
क्या हुआ चैंपियन?